Okay, as I was leaving to come to Hungary, this was the news being shown in Australia. And what I would especially like you to observe, wildfires are relatively uncommon in South Korea. The reason I want you to observe that is that wildfires are relatively uncommon in Hungary. So the problem of giving a talk on bushfires, and I'm going to use the term bushfire, but here's an English lesson for you all. In America, they do not understand the word bushfire. They use wildfire. If I say, but in Australia, wildfires are uniformly called bushfires. When I go to America and talk about bushfires, they think I'm mispronouncing brush fires. Anyway, so I'll probably end up using the term, but for international audiences, you'll see I've used the term wildfires. People understand that. So Sid asked me to somehow, tie my talk in to yesterday's. So yesterday's session was about difficult problems such as geothermal energy and how you can get interdisciplinary groupings to think deeply about it and provide solutions, do something useful about it. Now, wildfires in Australia are the quintessential difficult problem, and they involve almost every aspect of science and society. So what I'd like you to do is think about the methods that are being used to study the bushfires and then eventually to do something about them and see if that has some applicability. So what I'm going to talk about, give you a little brief geographic overview about their importance in Asia, America, Australia, Europe, maybe Hungary, maybe not. And then talk about the dependence on weather and climate, which means that climate change is going to be very important. And then, to tie it in with the theme of this conference, talk about air quality and health. So the other fires that were getting a lot of publicity in Australia, I presume they made the Hungarian media as well, were the Los Angeles fires. And the thing to notice there is something strange is going on. You don't normally expect large wildfires in winter. So there was a previous group of wildfires in Hawaii. I was very surprised because it was the middle of the tropical cyclone season. The two should be incompatible. They don't call them tropical cyclones there, they call them hurricanes or typhoons or something, but whatever. So something curious is happening in terms of fire regimes. But let me get into details about these fires. You heard me introduced as working for Safe System Solutions. That's actually my son's company. I retired. I used to be a scientist, and I'm now trying to pretend that I'm a road safety engineer. So look at this road. 6 lanes. It's the Pacific Highway. You would normally think that that would make a good fire break. If I was living in one of these houses, I would feel very happy, very secure. I wouldn't have thought my house would be burnt down by a wildfire. Have a look what happened. So the fires are getting more ferocious. They're happening at different times, and they're more widespread. I've put this picture up because that is the home of David Jackson, who was on the executive of the International Union of Geodesy and Geophysics when I was the president. He was the professor in UCLA, and that's what's left of his home in Pacific Palisades. So these disasters can get very personal as well. Let's come on to Australia. Australia is a very bushfire-prone country, which also means that we have a population that knows about it. But again, in 2019, people were surprised by the scale and ferocity of the fires. These fires destroyed more homes, were more intense over a longer duration than any previously recorded bushfire season, and it was the costliest natural disaster to date. What I found most interesting was that was a single event that meant that the climate deniers, the people who said climate change is not happening, and we have some very senior politicians who say climate change is not happening, this made climate change very significant in the Australian consciousness. A few of the photos of what goes on. I have a photo of the University of Sydney. And for those of you that have often wondered, why is Mars the god of war? Because the planet, when you look at it, is red. And the way I can tell when there's a bushfire going is that the sky is red. And I'm sure that the Romans realised that red is tied with fire, fire is tied with war, therefore that planet must have something to do with war. Let's move on to Europe. This shows the incidence of fires from many countries: Europe, USA, Canada, Russia, China, and Australia. You'll notice that there's large inter-year variability. But certain countries, fires are more important than others. In Europe, countries that spring to mind: Greece, Portugal, France. And then we get to the Hungarian situation. Hungary apparently has quite a number of forest fires, but overall they're not considered a significant problem. But what has happened in Canada and Australia is when the normal fire is just a small little thing running along the ground, the minute it gets up into the canopy, you have a totally different situation. That the fire, which has been manageable, suddenly becomes unmanageable. So that's what you're looking out for, this sudden transition from a manageable fire to a catastrophic fire. And according to various articles in Nature, Europe faces up to a 10-fold increase in extreme fires in a warming climate. So it may happen, it may not happen, it may affect Hungary, it may not affect Hungary. That one I can't tell you, but it's a great area for people to examine. As you can see, in particular, Central and Northern Europe will also become more susceptible to wildfires during droughts. So if you have a drought problem, it's likely that the fire problem will increase as well. Now, I seem to get a lot of publicity in 2019 during those big fires. I got interviewed by The Guardian, and what could I have done? The scientist who predicted the bushfire emergency 4 decades ago. I seem to be the first person who calculated quantitatively what would happen to fire danger in Australia if climate change were to happen. And this was in 1988. It was published in the proceedings of a conference, and it's a chapter of this book, Planning for Climate Change. So let me take you through how we did this back in 1988. In Australia, to work out the severity of a bushfire, you mix the wind, temperature, rain, and humidity and get something called the Forest Fire Danger Index. It's divided into logarithmic categories, but the story I want to tell you about this, not going into the details too much, is that this was the MacArthur fire danger meter when I did those calculations in 1988. Since then, they've discovered fires are bigger than the biggest number they put on the meter, 100. So they've had to introduce a whole new category called catastrophic fires. Back then, extreme fires were the most dangerous fires. For those of you that love mathematics, that's the formula that's used to derive that particular circular slide rule. And I, back in 1988, calculated the annual sum of that forest fire danger index for a town in Victoria called Sale. And the prediction I made in 1988, and which The Guardian just loved, was that if climate change were to happen, the fire danger every year, on average, will be the same as the Ash Wednesday fires of 1983, which at that time had been the most serious bushfires that they had had. And guess what? That happened around about here. So Australian fire danger now, on average, every year is worse than it was during the 1983 bushfires. Out of interest, though, I then made a list of eponymous bushfires in Victoria. I discovered my grandchildren didn't know what eponymous meant. I'm sure the Greek scholars amongst us do, but basically, if they give a fire a name. Now, of course, you could say every fire has a name, but generally the name is geographic, the Victoria fire or the Melbourne fire or whatever. But these were so bad that they got a special name. And what interested me is the sequence of intervals in years between such name fires as 40 years, 28 years, 13 years. Then it jumps to 44, 26, 10. I used to go around giving TV interviews and telling people that the interval was getting shorter. And then I realised, well, maybe it isn't getting shorter. I don't know, it's going to be probably another 100 years before we work out whether that cycle repeats or not. I personally think the time interval is getting shorter, but maybe not. Right, that's the calculations. Let me just go back. Probably the take-home message there is this one, that relative humidity is the best single predictor of fire danger because it has about a triple whammy, that the vegetation's drying out, the soil's drying out, and the air is dry. So most people think when it's hot is when you're going to get serious fires. Yes, but relative humidity is more important. So we've dealt with that. We've dealt with that. And this is just what I told you earlier. I can't remember the form of my own talks anymore. Okay, so bushfire risk. So what are the risks to people associated with these bushfires? Well, air quality is an obvious one because you have a lot of smoke. Now, the health effects of smoke were worked out in detail, or I tried in detail, because the way, in fire management, people believe that if you can do hazard reduction burning, lots of little fires frequently, then it will stop these big fires. The problem is there are also air pollution regulations, which means that you can only do those burns at certain times. And so we had to work out, well, what is the best way to do a hazard reduction burn? And all I want to show you here is that science has advanced to the stage where you can make these quantitative predictions of what would happen if you burnt in one long line, what would happen if you burnt in little ellipses, and then you can see whether they're above or below the air pollution regulations. And people do complain that they can't see this laser pointer, and they're perfectly correct. The minute I go here, I can't see it, but it might just be my bad eyesight. Another possible feature of bushfire smoke was the question of dioxins. There was some evidence that maybe dioxins were important in bushfires. We had a look at it, and again, it was one of these things that needed further study because there was some evidence, but then when the further study was done, we discovered the dioxin emissions in bushfires are not hazardous to firefighters because the earlier calculations were based on laboratory fires. My guess is that the wood that they were using in the laboratory fires had been treated and was emitting dioxins, whereas in the natural situation it probably wasn't. The other possibility, well, no, there are still lots of uncertainties in that area. Now, Victoria had big bushfires in 2009, and for those of you not familiar with Australian geography, Australia is divided into states. Victoria is one of the states, and the capital of Victoria is Melbourne. Another state is New South Wales, and most people have heard of the capital of New South Wales, which is Sydney. The capital of the whole country is Canberra. Anyway, so it's almost mandatory after one of those eponymous bushfires that you're going to have a royal commission. That's a commission of inquiry that then examines what happened, why, what went wrong, what would you do, how can we make it better next time. So the recommendation 62 was that Vic Roads implement a systematic statewide program of bushfire risk assessment for all roads for which it is responsible to ensure conformity with the obligations in Section 43 of the Country Fire Authority Act and with the objectives expressed in the Vic Roads Code of Practice. The reason I'm doing this is because I told you at the beginning I now work for a road safety consultancy, and so this was relevant to us, and indeed. Some of the stupidities that the Royal Commission identified were the ways in which roadblocks operated, among them inflexibility, poor communication, and denying access to firefighters. If you think that sounds stupid, it was. I mean, the police set up a roadblock, and the police were under orders, well, you don't let anybody in, and along come the firefighters to fight the fire. No, sorry, we can't let anybody in. So it's one of these many bureaucratic stupidities that happens in life. I won't go through those. So we've helped prepare a road bushfire risk assessment guideline and risk mapping methodology. That's our company report there, and that's the final report that was produced by the state of Victoria. And in the end, they produced a video to try to increase community awareness of many of these problems, probably the most significant of which is that the smoke means you can't see, so it is probably not a good idea to drive through a bushfire. So have a look at the video. I hope it started. No? Press this again and it'll start.
I know how fast grass fires can spread. You'll want to escape, but you shouldn't drive. The smoke is blinding. And you'll block roads for emergency vehicles. Just walk 2 streets back and check warnings on the Vic Emergency app.
Authorised by the Victorian Government.
Okay, now before I get to questions, I would like to invite Catalin and Sid to come up because way back about 25 years ago, I ran a workshop, a bit like this one, on air pollution and health risk. And the proceedings are here, and you might wish to have an idea of how we try to get about doing what you're trying to do and get interdisciplinary groupings from different disciplines to work together, which is one of getting those air quality scientists to work with health professionals. So may I?
Thank you very much, Tom, for this inspiring and really interesting presentation. Now I would like to ask if there are any questions. Taras, sorry, he was for you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Is it known how big is CO2 contribution to the global budget from the wildfire, and what is the dynamic of this contribution through years?
It depends why you're asking the question. If you are asking the question for greenhouse gas emissions methodologies, the answer is zero, because carbon dioxide from wildfires is treated as non-anthropogenic, so it doesn't have to be counted in your emissions inventories. If you're asking it as a scientist, which is how much real CO2 comes out, I've forgotten what the answer is, because we haven't considered that important to work it out.
Okay, I see. Yeah, but it would be, I'm really curious as a scientist, how big compared to anthropogenic emissions.
The time scale is incredibly important because, of course, you've got the fire and then the regrowth uptakes that CO2 more quickly while it's in its growing phase. When it's in its mature phase, it balances out, and then it's still taking in carbon dioxide, but not quite as quickly. Though somehow, I used to know those numbers once, I don't anymore.
Thank you.
I think Rein did too.
Reinhard probably carries them in his head.
Well, actually, we have this problem also in Germany. Just in the state of Brandenburg, which is one of our 16 states, we had last year 400 forest fires, but they were very small because we have smoke detection. The reason why we have done this throughout the country is that we have changed our forest management. What we do today, and actually I think this is also a problem in the US, particularly in the Sierra Nevada and in the Bernardino Mountains, close to Los Angeles, we leave much more fuel in the forest, which we former times took out. Why? Because there's the nutrients for water aspects and building up organic matter. But this is, under these conditions of forest fires, gives you the fuel that the fire goes up into the ground and get these hot catastrophic fires. Mm-hmm. So for that reason, we have implemented a tremendously efficient and successful smoke detection situation in our forests. So we have fires, but they are detected very early, and then management is going on. We had a big fire 2 years ago, and we did study the question of carbon emission from the soil. And in these cases, where you have a pine forest, it was 40 tons per hectare of carbon that was emitted during the fire or as effect of the fire. And then you have the aspects that you mentioned. We have up to about 100 tons of carbon in our forest soils on a hectare basis. And so almost half was lost during this fire. Yeah. And of course, the building up will take a long time. So forest fires are a serious aspect, not only for human beings, but also for the climate, because you have huge CO2 emissions, and you have reduction of taking up because you're missing the forest thereafter.
There's three things there. One is surprised, but that must be pine forests, because Australian eucalypt forests are about 10 tonnes per hectare. 40 tonnes per hectare sounds very large to me. Secondly, fire management is a very wicked social issue. Now, it may probably not appropriate to Germany, probably not appropriate to Hungary, but in Canada and Australia, the indigenous treatment of fire has become a strong political issue. That, if you like, Europeans are blamed for these wildfires because they introduced European farm management practices, and had the native management practices been permitted to continue, then everything would be fine and we would not have these big fires. The third thing, of course, tying this talk into the opening session by Sylvester, somebody, I've forgotten his surname. Anyway, he pointed out the mental health can be an issue. Now, mental health of firefighters, but also the mental health of the survivors of a catastrophic fire is a very important issue. And I had another colleague. He was a researcher on fires. You would think he would know everything about fire. And he was caught in that Ash Wednesday fire of 1983. And he said he could not believe how terrifying it is to be inside a fire like that. The noise alone is enough to totally unnerve you.
Thank you very much. Are there any quick questions? If not, then thank you again.
Thank you very much.